Okay, so you've the quiz Wednesday through Friday, and I've had some quiz questions or questions about the quiz, and it's online, and it will become available Wednesday. What day is it? It's Tuesday. Wednesday at midnight was the plan. So I'll double check and make sure that I have it set properly, because sometimes I mean, like Wednesday at 12:01. So like if you're up, don't take it to tonight at midnight. I mean, you can if you want. What do I care when you take it? Maybe that's when you get off work or something. So say whatever you like. It should become live tonight, midnight, tomorrow morning, 12:01. So Wednesday through Friday, it should be available through Friday through 11:59 p.m. So that's where it'll be. Also, apologies, I need to grade. So I'll grade tonight and or tomorrow. So if you've turned some stuff in, had a couple people email, would you look at my answer? And I think I answered all of those people. So I think we're good. I also posted the questions for the next unit, the weekly questions. So I'll try to get the weekly quiz or the unit quiz review up, around the time. Who am I kidding? It's probably the study. Yes, the study guide's on Blackboard. Yep, it is. Pretty much everything's on Blackboard. All that stuff should be in, I gotta let someone else in. All that stuff should be in the course documents section. Course documents. And if you can't find it, let me know. But look first. Also, there's somebody, I don't know if they're in this class, that I don't know, they're asking a whole bunch of questions, which made me think they haven't read the syllabus. So I'll answer your questions, but I'll also add in there, this is in the syllabus. Pretty much everything's in the syllabus, like, procedurally, and then document-wise, if you look in the course documents section, that should be where it is. So if you look and don't find it, please let me know, and I'll probably answer. Yeah, unless you email like Thursday night at midnight or Friday, at 11:30. All right, more people in the waiting room. All right, so I'll stop in the middle for a couple minutes to take roll, I think. And I'm assuming if you have questions, you'll put them in the chat, because you have been, so thanks. All right, so today we're talking about Spanish-American War. So let's look at the stuff for today, the notes, and the weekly question. We'll look at the weekly question first, just to remind ourselves. So weekly question is, causes of, stated purposes for, and eventual results of U.S. entry into the Spanish-American War, discuss USS Maine, Teller and Platt amendments. So when you discuss the Teller and Platt amendments, tell me what they did, and what they amended would be good too. And dates are always nice. The handy thing about Spanish-American War is you could just put 1898 for all the dates, and you'd be correct, because pretty much everything happens. It's really short. Yeah. Do the citizens of the new U.S. territories prosper, enjoy freedom, and accept American rule? There have been some people who have turned this one in already, because they're overachievers, which is nice. But they didn't talk at all about, they just said, they said, I don't want to tell you what they said. They said stuff that suggested they'd not read the chapter. The chapter, Dr. Foner, your book author, is incredibly specific about that last part of the question. Did they have freedom, that kind of stuff? Because it does point out some interesting things, how we treated folks in those territories versus how we treat American citizens versus how colonists insisted they would be treated back in the 1776-ish times. So be sure, to look in the book. All the answers to that one are in the book. Yeah. That should be good. All right, let's look at the notes. All right, there they are. I could make them bigger, right? Sorry. You would think I would be better at this. One page. There we go. Oh my goodness. Now I've been reading all the interesting things that happen to people in their online classes, and I don't know, just glad the worst thing that seems to go on is people don't pay attention. So thanks for not doing too many crazy things. Appreciate it. All right. So in case you wonder what's going on politically during this time period, you have this whole section about the Populist Party, and there's some, I feel like there's some questions on the quiz about the Populist Party. So what you have here is a bunch of unhappy or angry farmers. If you're wondering why are farmers angry, I would be if I were a farmer, because everything I try to grow dies. So I would be an unsuccessful farmer. But the reason farmers are angry, it's kind of legitimate. Excuse me. Oh, gosh. The reason farmers are angry is the government's really not very helpful to them. Now, if you're wondering, should the government be helpful to farmers or businessmen? I don't know. I mean, it kind of depends on what the people expect of the government and what the time period is. Now, as a rule, the government wasn't very helpful to very many people throughout most of our history. They mostly just guarded the borders, maybe built an army and a navy, maybe kind of depends on the time period, and maybe defended, like I said, defended the borders, that kind of stuff. And of course, ran whoever was on the land that we wanted off the land. So you have that going on. But generally, if you had a problem, you didn't go to the government. I mean, that's been true throughout most of history. You would go to your family or your friends or your church. So there wasn't a huge expectation that the government would solve individual problems, societal problems, that sort of thing. And this economy where you buy stuff, sell stuff, there's an international market, it's just developing during this time period. So government economic policy was also just developing during this time period. So the government was pretty supportive of big business during this time period because big business controlled the government. They donated money, they literally bought politicians' votes, that sort of thing, because there weren't rules or laws against it, because we'd really never had people so rich before that weren't the rulers, kings and queens and that kind of thing, that they could afford to do this, or, in different types of governmental systems, city, state kind of things. Usually the rich people were already in charge. So we have a new era where you can be rich and not control the government, through business, that sort of thing, not just because your family owned land for a million years. So now these rich guys are using their money to buy influence. And, we've never had, well, we've had it before. I mean, you've had world history. So, the House of Lords and House of Commons, there's definitely originally a difference in who's represented there, but usually landowners were the wealthy people. This is a new era, so now businessmen are becoming the wealthy people. So the landowners are feeling a little left out, and they also feel like government policy is favoring business people, mostly because it is. So farmers in the Midwest and the West would not have considered themselves wealthy landowners, and that's fair. I mean, during this time period, these guys are not always, some of them are, but most of them are not terribly wealthy people. They're frustrated because most of the railroad lines that they need to transport their product back and forth are overcharging them. Also, new technology like telegraph and then telephone is much more expensive in remote areas, the same way railroad transportation is, than it would be in urban areas. So they feel like they're being overcharged for stuff, and they probably are. Also, they are becoming more productive because they're more corporate farmers. They're using mechanized equipment. And all that stuff's expensive, so it's costing them more money to produce their crops. But because they're more productive, the price that they're getting for the crops is going down. They tend to respond to that by growing more crops, which makes the crop price go down even more. So they kind of seem to be consistently making less and less money, even though they're more and more productive. So their costs are going up. The amount of money that they're making for their crops is going down. And because they don't work together, I mean, a farmer's kind of an independent agent, they don't form cooperatives where they all agree like, hey, we're only going to sell our crops if we get this amount of money. And sometimes they undercut each other. They don't work together. And, you know, farms aren't really designed to do that. So they kind of, I don't know, it's not going well for them financially. So what they decide is that they will make a political party. So they do. And they form something called the Populist Party, which comes out of, excuse me for the yawn, farmers' alliances, which are groups of farmers that get together, kind of unlike the National Grange, they got together to talk about, hey, let's grow this crop and this crop at the same time because they complement the soil. You know, this one takes nitrogen out and this one puts it in. Or, you know, hey, I heard that if you use this aphid, it'll get rid of that pest, or, you know, I don't know what I'm talking about there. But, you know, they talked about different things they could do to be more productive and what they could grow, that kind of stuff, what grew best where, and, you know, what new things that were coming in on the market that were selling well. They talked about a lot of those things in the Grange, but the Grange, which was a farmers organization before the Alliance, was really meant to be apolitical. So they weren't supposed to talk about politics at all. So they didn't. But the whole purpose of the Populist or the Farmers Alliance was to organize for both political and economic purposes. They would form co-ops, try to sell their grain corporately, that sort of thing, help each other finance big ticket items like threshers or reapers or the cotton gin. No, you couldn't finance the cotton gin. That thing was expensive. But anyway, but less expensive things than the cotton gin, but more expensive equipment. So they tried to help each other out because they didn't see that banks or other organizations were very helpful. Okay, so we have all the details here. Southern farmers are especially having problems because their market has disappeared. Farmers are upset about prices for rising transportation and communication. They form the alliances to do all the stuff we talked about. Hard to do because they live far apart. And organizing is hard. I mean, they didn't have Zoom or anything, so it was difficult. They do allow African American members, but they have segregated alliance units. And the Grange was just for white guys. They're going to form a political party, which will be known as the People's Party or the Populist Party. And they're pretty successful in farming states. Now, they're not successful at the national level, but they do have enough success to run some candidates for president. So I would be just vaguely aware of those if you, as you kind of go through this. Their success is really much more local, state, and national elections. There was time in the 1890s where they controlled the Congress and the governorship in Texas, which is a fairly agricultural / ranching kind of place, as you know. So in 1892, the fellow James Weaver runs for president as a populist. Their slogan is raise less corn and more health, and probably less corn would have helped them financially too because the price would have gone up. But he does get over 1 million votes for president, which is a pretty good number in 1892. They also understood that a party just for farmers was not going to win the presidency because truthfully, there's fewer and fewer farmers each year, even starting back then because they're so productive. So they needed to throw some stuff in. Sorry for scrolling there. They needed to toss some stuff in that would appeal to people that were not farmers, which is most people. So They also favored a minimum wage, voting rights for women, which, I mean, that's a good call. Of course, women aren't voting, but you know, that's not bad. And a sub-treasury system. Now, I'll give you the quick version of the sub-treasury system. You don't ever need to know the long version, but sub-treasury system, the US government would purchase excess crops that farmers couldn't sell, and they would store them for the farmers essentially for free, and they would give them money for those crops. The money was essentially a loan, and once the crops were sold, they would repay the loan. So it's sort of like price supports or essentially a minimum wage for farmers. So no matter how much they grew, somebody would buy it. And the government could afford to store it, and then maybe they would give it away to people, you know, maybe for people who were food insufficient, that sort of thing. But that's way before our government did stuff like that, so that doesn't catch on, you know, quite at that time. But they do propose these things. They also talked about an 8-hour workday. So they're clearly, with a minimum wage and 8-hour workday, trying to appeal to factory workers. They're not going to have a lot of success appealing to factory workers because factory workers have some other things going on politically, which we will talk about a little later. So farmers try to attract non-farmers. They're not terribly successful in 1892, but they do get over 1 million votes. In 1896, they nominate the same guy that the Democrats nominate, a fellow named William Jennings Bryan. He's young when he runs for president in 1896. I think he's 36. I wasn't there, you know, I don't remember for sure, but I'm pretty sure he was 36. Sorry. If you were wondering, how old do you have to be president? 35. We haven't ever had a president in their 30s, but we've had a few in their 40s. So William Jennings Bryan is a really good public speaker. That's kind of what he's known for. He goes across the country and gives hundreds and hundreds of speeches, the most famous of which is called the Cross of Gold speech, which is fairly famous in that era. If you read the whole thing, you'll notice like he's saying some things we wouldn't say nowadays. That's true of a lot of speeches in 1896. But he compares farmers to Jesus and says that the way we treat farmers is like crucifying them. And they crucify them on a cross of gold because we're using a gold standard, which helps businessmen more than farmers, according to populist economic philosophy. So they want to introduce a silver standard so that we would coin more silver and we would get more inflation. And their thought is if we had more inflation, crop prices would go up, which is probably true. I don't know if they figured in that maybe the prices they paid for stuff would also go up, but they figured inflation would be really beneficial for farmers and it would cause crop prices to rise. So they wanted inflation. And part of the speech was, shall you place upon the farmer the crown of thorns, shall you crucify the farmer on the cross of gold. And in that era, there's an assumption, and it's statistically pretty correct, that every voter in the United States is a Christian, and probably whether they go to church or not, which they probably do, because back in those days, pretty much people went to church, they're familiar with the Bible. So when you look at political speeches or political rhetoric from that era, and honestly up through the 1950s for sure, and occasionally, you know, since then, a few times in your lifetime, it's pretty common for politicians, again, especially back in those days, to quote the Bible or make biblical references. This is tricky sometimes in the modern era when you study English or history, which are two things I have degrees in, because they make lots of biblical references, especially if you're studying American literature, American history, you know, or what, you know, Western literature, that sort of stuff as well. So it's tricky if you are unfamiliar with the Bible. And I always tell people, we used to offer a Bible literacy class in high school. I know some of you are going like, oh, that's a terrible idea. And it could be. I'm not going to disagree with you. I mean, if you had somebody in there preaching, yes, that's problematic. But for history, politics, and literature, especially in the West, it is important to get some basic references. So, you know, I'm not trying to, yeah, that's all I'm saying. So we'll keep going. Other stuff that, I mentioned that the Democrats also nominated William Jennings Bryan. They did it first, and then the Populists had their convention later. Other platform items, minimum wage. They also talked about the 8-hour workday, free coinage of silver. And by free coinage of silver, it doesn't mean everybody got free silver coins. It meant that they didn't have a limit to the amount of silver coins they would put in circulation. So this would dramatically increase inflation, which was the goal. And this is right after they found a whole bunch of silver, especially in the Colorado. So those silver mining companies also were really in favor of this as well. If you look at some of the acts passed during this time period that coined silver, typically those acts really just bought silver and they didn't really release the coins into circulation. So it tended to help the mining companies, but not the poorer people who thought that increasing inflation would be useful to them. Government ownership of telephone, telegraph, and railroad, because as I mentioned earlier, people in the West, farmers, ranchers, especially thought that these three industries, telephone, telegraph, and railroad, overcharged them. And they did charge them different rates than they would charge people in the East because there wasn't as much competition. And they felt like that populists, farmers, ranchers, felt like that was unfair. And if the government owned those, they would run them more fairly and perhaps they would do a better job. So, you know, who knows? It was early. All right. 1896, the election has 3 different parties. It's a really complicated election. And Democrats and Republicans, my opinion, and you can look at facts to determine if my opinion is very useful here. I'm not sure Democrats and Republicans were terribly different during this time period. They both seemed kind of interested in getting corporate money. And I guess we could stop there. That's pretty much it. Now, some people would argue that the Democrats still were a little more on the states' rights, kind of make decisions locally, enforce decisions locally, kind of bandwagon. And some of that's about issues in the South, but, you know, the Republicans may be slightly a little more of a national party where they want to implement some stuff nationally, but there's not very many things that they want to implement nationally. Like they definitely are not pushing for government ownership of telephone, telegraph, and railroad. That just seems weird to people during that time period. So what happens in 1896 is you've got William Jennings Bryan, who gets the nomination of the Democrats and the Populists. And he does the go around the country, travel, and give speeches. And that really is how politics had worked before this era. But, you know, you've got railroads now. And even though most people don't travel on railroads, each train does have a car or two for people. So you can travel on them. And as time goes along, there'll be much more railroad travel, for sure. McKinley is going to really kind of stay home and use money to advertise. And I know you're thinking, Serna, they did not have TV back then. That's true. They didn't have radio. They didn't have those. Are you guys getting those texts where it's like, I'm Fred from the Texas Democrats, and I want to know if you'll vote for MJ Hagar. Or I got something from the Republican National Committee yesterday wanting to know how much money I would give to Donald Trump. So, I mean, it's good. Everyone loves me and wants me to vote for them and give them money. So text advertising, and you see it on Facebook a little bit, that sort of thing. Facebook, you guys don't do that. Do they have that kind of thing on Instagram or Snapchat? Oh no, because I'm old. But the only place you could advertise back in those days, newspaper. But because there weren't a whole lot of media outlets, people read the newspaper. So it's pretty effective advertising, I think. Also, billboards, sides of buildings in cities. So the McKinley campaign spends a lot of money on advertising. Trying to say and didn't really say. So McKinley spends a lot of money on advertising, and he does travel a little, but not too much. He runs what they call a front porch campaign, which could mean that he just stays on his front porch and people come to see him and hear what he thinks. It's not exactly what it means. It really means he doesn't travel very much. Now, he would say he had lovely reasons for not traveling. His wife was epileptic. If she had seizures, he liked to be there. She didn't do as well when she traveled. You'll get to hear a little about McKinley as president. You may or may not be impressed. Most people thought, nice husband. I'm not sure that that's necessarily a great qualification. I had a nice husband, was super glad to have that, but I don't know that that would have qualified him to be, presidential candidate. Maybe, I don't know. But McKinley, I don't know about him as president, but he does. Marcus Hanna, his campaign manager, runs the first modern presidential campaign, spent a lot of money on advertising, funded by wealthy businessmen. And, Bryan really is much more of a populist in the traditional sense, in addition to being the representative of the Populist Party. So when you see populist with the big P, it represents this political party of farmers. Populist little p means the people wanted him. And populist politicians in the modern era, probably more like Bernie Sanders. I think he's a little more of a populist style politician where the party looks at him and goes, oh no. But people tend to like him. They go like, I like those ideas. That sounds interesting, that kind of stuff, especially, younger people, which is fascinating to me because he seems older. But his ideas, are appealing to different groups of people who don't run political parties. And I think that's another thing William Jennings Bryan may have had in common, as a populist, maybe a little. I'm not comparing him to Bernie Sanders. There's no, there aren't too many people in this era that we should compare to Bernie Sanders, or in the modern era, to be honest. He's unique, which I think is part of his appeal. But anyway, back to William Jennings Bryan. Even though he has the support of two different parties, he loses by quite a bit. Now, the Populist Party had an issue that was adopted by a major party. Now, in our system, you may have noticed that pretty much no other country in the world has two political parties that tend to consistently control elections. They usually have a multi-party system, and then people have to form coalitions and have to compromise to get stuff done. We clearly don't have a system like that. So what happens in our system is if we get a third party that has an issue that people think is important, and they start to get votes, like, 1 million up here in 1892, then one of the two major parties typically notices that and says, you know what? That cost us 1 million votes. We're going to take up their issue. So the Democrats likely took up this populist issue of, farmers' concerns to make sure that those 1 million people voted for them instead of the Republicans. Not to be just completely cynical, but that's probably what happened. And then the Populist Party will disappear after this, and then the Democrats probably won't care that much about farmers. Maybe a little. I don't know. I do know. But that won't be part of their party platform consistently moving forward. Now, what you'll see later, because some of you are going like, I don't know about her, because I know that the government does support farmers a lot more than they used to. You'll see a lot of that happen during the Great Depression. It's coming. It is. So, and historically, really quickly. Okay. So McKinley runs front porch campaign, spends the money, that kind of stuff. In case you were wondering, Why are the factory workers not voting for populist? It really has a lot to do with local elections, and the book talks about this just a teeny weeny bit. There's a lot of political corruption during this era. That's probably shocking. And most people would consider that, no, not most people, lots of historians, will go with that, would consider this era to be possibly the most corrupt in US history politically. And I know some of you are going like, I thought now was bad. Now is pretty weird. I'm not going to deny that. But you know, there were no rules about campaign contributions, secret ballots, that sort of stuff during this era. So you could just do a lot of stuff because it wasn't illegal. This is the era that makes a lot of stuff illegal. It's not just political stuff. You know, there's health and safety stuff that becomes illegal because of this era as well. So, you know, this is the era where we first become big and corporate and have, you know, these large businesses and have lots of money spent on politics. So, you know, we didn't even know how corrupt we could be until this period, potentially, or how wealthy we could be, you know, especially at the top end. So factory workers are told by their bosses who they should vote for. Their bosses are going to vote for whoever locally controls the political system or the political machine. Now, in this era, almost all the political machines that controlled large city government were Democrats. So most factory workers are going to vote for Democrats because their boss told them to. And maybe you're wondering, like, how does their boss even know? Because their boss has somebody who works at the polling station and checks. They just go over, they got a little clipboard, and they, I don't know if they had a clipboard, but they probably did. And they just checked off who they voted for because they either looked at their ballot while they were voting, or they looked at it when they dropped their ballot into the ballot box, which was made of glass, so you could see through it. So there were no secret ballots during this era. So if the factory workers didn't vote for who their bosses told them to vote for, they got fired, because you can replace workers pretty easily during this era because, you know, 30 million people are immigrating during this era. So this factory worker populist, not being drawn to populist appeal, really was about those corrupt city governments or political machines who controlled city government. So they typically wanted people just to vote for all Democrats up and down the line. Please don't, you know, misinterpret, and, you know, because some of you go like, yeah, and big cities still tend to be controlled by Democrats. It's like, yeah, that is true. But I am not suggesting anything about modern politics about, you know, you can come to your own conclusions about those. But political machines were just really overt groups of folks who said, if you don't vote for me, you're not going to get a city contract, you're going to lose your job, we're going to not give you police protection. So they were overtly corrupt groups of folks who gave away government contracts. I think, well, I know the most famous one is this William Bostweed, who'd be interesting to read about, maybe, if you like political stuff, for your book review. And he was in New York City, and his syndicate controlled both city and county government. And I guess their most famous graft kind of incident was the New York County Courthouse. They gave out over $20 million in contracts to build that, which is, it's a ridiculous amount of money for that time period. I know when they did courthouse renovations in Georgetown, Texas, for Williamson County Courthouse, they spent like $5 million. And that was, you know, in the last 10 years. So $20 million on this courthouse is exorbitant. They never finished building it. So they were just giving away just giving away taxpayer money. So incredibly corrupt, and, you know, knew too much about everybody. So that part, I think, has been improved. You may or may not agree. Okay. I think I will pause for just a moment to, oh, somebody has a question. Oh, no, they didn't. Yeah. Oh, since a couple of you are asking, oh my goodness. When I put comments in when I grade your homework, it's really just to kind of guide you to think about other types of detail you could put in. But I really don't want you to redo it because I have 100 students and I don't want to grade all of your work 3 times. I just don't. Plus, it's college, and my boss frowns on such things. So, I think I'd mentioned this last week. If we get to, what I'd really like for you to do is the current work, just do a more detailed job on that, if you would. And if we get to a point in the course where it looks like you need 2 points and you got 5 out of 10 on your first weekly question, that would probably be the point where I would say, like, hey, instead of just begging me for 2 points, why don't you go back and redo weekly question number 2? So that would be more my preference on, can I redo stuff? So the big answer is no, because I'm not supposed to allow it. Honestly, it's not, I have enough trouble keeping up with grading without doing everything 3 times. And the truth is, your energy is better spent on the current assignments and doing better on those. If we get to a point toward the middle or end of the class where it's not looking good for you, maybe, I would need to offer the same option to all students. That's also kind of a college thing. So, I will just make a blanket statement that in general, if you're just lacking a point or 2, I would absolutely say to you toward the end of the class, if you'll redo this, I'll look at it. But I would count on, using that feedback to maybe guide what you do moving forward. I don't know if that's even close to the answer that you wanted, but there it is. Okay. I'm going to take just a minute to kind of cross off some people on the roll sheet. So if you need to take a break for like just 2-3 minutes, you know what you might need to take a break for. So if you need to, go ahead. And you can ask questions while I look through
I still sort of had
attendance as well, and I'll try to be fast. We'll see how that goes. All right. And you can talk to each other or share like study information in the chat or whatever you guys do.
Professor Serna?
Are you asking a question? I can't hear. I'm sorry.
Can you hear me? Let's see.
Oh, I see that you guys have typed something in the chat, so I will check in just a minute, I promise, if I need to. I know you guys can probably answer each other's questions, but dang it. Okay. And then before we leave, if I don't have somebody on the roll, I'll probably just ask really quick. And most of the stuff for the weekly question we'll talk about next time, sorry. We'll try to get a little of it in today. Almost done, almost done. And then I promise I'll look in the chat. I should have paused the recording, huh? Okay, I think I got it all. All right, I'm looking at the chat. Sorry. Sorry, I couldn't hear you, Alex. Oh. Once you turn in something, if I've graded it, that's the point where I probably wouldn't want you to redo it. I mean, it's all technically due on the 18th. I just don't want to keep regrading it 15 times, especially once I've given you feedback, because that's definitely an advantage that other people don't have. Sorry. And apologies if I didn't make that very clear. And the study for the quiz on Blackboard should be in the course documents section. It'll probably say something like study guide for weekly quiz or weekly timed questions, one of those things. Yeah, almost anything you're looking for is going to be on the course documents section. And I'm assuming you can all hear the answers. Otherwise, you would keep typing and say, you muted yourself again. So, all right, anything else? Yeah, and I'm sorry that I couldn't hear. Goodness. All right. And if you have an individual question about your grade or something like that, feel free to send me an email. That's completely fine. And I think at least one of you has, so, but maybe just yesterday and I haven't answered it yet. So sorry, so far behind on stuff. All right, back to this. And just want to make sure 11:50. Okay, I'm not saying I'm going, the whole time. I just know I need to finish before then. Okay. Oh my goodness. All right. I was reading something about lynching on Facebook. I don't know. You guys are young, so maybe you don't have Facebook, but old people have Facebook. And sorry if I just called you old and you have Facebook. So people will post all their vast knowledge of everything on Facebook. And I was reading, about lynchings and that kind of stuff. I was like, oh my gosh, it's really sad that people don't know anything about history. But they said, I don't want to talk about that. I'm sorry, but I'll talk about this stuff. So segregation is becoming a bigger problem during this era. Of course, you did the weekly question probably, where you talked about the end of Reconstruction and how the North pretty much says, you know what, we're out South. You just protect voters in the South and we'll trust you, which is a bad move. I mean, it just is. So Southern states now get to reconstruct their governments however they like after the bargain of 1877. And honestly, there's no Black voting going on in the South after that era, because who wants to die to vote? I mean, it's a high cost. And the KKK is really unchecked during this time period because nobody's using the enforcement acts anymore. We're not sending in the troops to protect Black voters. Southerners don't want them to vote. And so they don't. So the Supreme Court does not require Southern states to enforce equal protection laws, voting laws. They pass poll taxes, literacy tests, the grandfather clause to exempt poor white guys who are uneducated from poll taxes and literacy tests. And then the case Plessy versus Ferguson, which is hugely important, establishes and leads to the spread of segregation. So this fellow Plessy, Homer Adolph Plessy, before World War II, when that name, was still used, is a pretty wealthy dude in the New Orleans area, and he is mixed race. Now, there are like 4 or 5 large cities in the South where people who are mixed race can kind of live in those and have some success and mostly be left alone, kind of, sort of, most of the time, within reason. For the era, let me add that. So I'm not suggesting that Blacks and whites or people of mixed race and whites are treated equally in any of these places. I'm just saying there are larger communities where they can kind of coexist a little more peacefully, but You know, they're not going to get equal treatment from law enforcement or the government or anything like that. And I know some of you are going like, does that happen now? It happens more in that era, true now as well, if you have money. Shocking as well. So Plessy's a fairly well-off dude, but he could pass, as they would say back in, he looks white. He's a fair-skinned African-American dude. So but everybody knows him because he's pretty well-off dude. So he's riding the train one day and he says, you know what? I paid the same amount. I want to ride in the white people car. Now on the train, the white people car is in the back because the train, the closer you sit to the engine, the more stuff you get on you from the engine, ruins your clothes, that kind of stuff. So plus he's like, yeah, I'm sitting in the back. I don't want to have to change clothes when I get where I'm going. And the people running the train knew him and they go like, no, sir, you have to ride in the black car, which is in the front. And he said, I paid the same. I'm not riding there. So they arrested him. And his goal, honestly, was to get arrested and to go to court and to set a precedent that if you paid the same amount for a service or a good, that you got the same thing. But the Supreme Court instead says, as long as it's separate but basically equal, it's fine. So it establishes the doctrine of separate but equal and actually leads to the spread of segregation, not only just in the South, but throughout the North and in the West in different ways as well. Although the West was doing a fine job with their own segregation, and the North was too, to a certain extent. But this will cause segregation to spread. New political leaders in the South are referred to as redeemers, and they're going to try to restore the South to its past grandeur, past culture and economy, which is why they're still growing cotton. And you don't see a big change in agricultural diversity. They're not going to grow other stuff as their main cash crop for a while. The book talks a lot about this, and oh crud. Trying to think what is the name of I can't remember the name of the book that would be really good if you were interested in this. It's about Parchman Farm. So it might just be called Parchman Farm. I've got a copy of it somewhere because I read it. But it's related to this prison thing. So prisons really grow, and your book does a nice job talking about this, and you'll see growth of this system again in the 1930s in a really big way. If you watch old movies, I watch very few movies, but I've seen this one. It's called Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? It's a really weird movie, but I like it because it has some historical implications and it's not overly violent because I'm sort of wimpy about those things. But this movie kind of reflects, well, the farm that they ran off of, the prison farm they ran off of, is that Parchman Farm. But during this era, and then again in an even bigger way in the 1930s, you imprisoned people to take away their freedom, and then you could rent them out and make money from their labor. God. So prisons grew at an astounding rate during that time period, and they used the convict labor to build stuff, roads, and there were instances where the prison warden used them to build things at his house. You could rent, if you ran the prison, you rented the convict labor to wealthy people in the area, or you had them work for the government for free. So they put people in prison for really petty crimes, mostly because they were poor and they could get away with it. And it's especially true if you're poor and Black. And honestly, in the South, I mean, even, I'm not saying something terrible happened to Plessy. He did get arrested. He didn't, end up on a chain gang or anything. But if you're poor, Black, and Southern, your life is super difficult during this time period, more difficult than just being poor, So I'm not kind of trying to completely equate socioeconomic stuff, to separate it from race. But yeah, if you're poor and Black, it is not a good scene for you in the South. But one institution that you do see growing consistently in this era is prisons. You'll see a little reform during the Progressive era, and then we'll go back to the system that we are discussing here in the 1930s. You may, and some people would argue we still have something similar. In Texas, if you pay attention to state politics, we have a really large system of private prisons who do similar sorts of things. So they may or may not do the chain gang kind of thing, but they have labor within the prison, and they'll have people make things or perform a certain sort of service, and they'll make money from that. Lynching was a big deal during this time period, and I remember going to, I think if you go to that link, it's still live. I haven't checked since, well, no, I checked this summer, so probably hasn't changed since then. But lynching it's more of a Southern thing than any other part of the country, but you do see it in other parts of the country as well. They kept as many statistics as they could about this. It's primarily African American men, occasionally African American women. It's occasionally like a horse thief, occasionally a white dude, but it's something like 95% of the time African American men. And this happened a lot. I mean, I don't know how to quantify a lot for you. There'll be some statistics. It's enough that what was typical about lynchings is that they weren't considered illegal and they were very public. I think the way we think about lynchings, if we ever think about lynchings, there are some of you probably think about it more than others, just depending on your background and your interest in history, and your interest in civil rights. Lynchings typically were very public, and what would happen is they would accuse someone, primarily African American man, of doing something he shouldn't do, almost always a sexual impropriety, which could be anything as little as looking at a white woman. And when we get to the civil rights movement, we'll talk about this quite a bit more, because this still is a thing during the 1950s and 60s and 70s occasionally. And when I was teaching high school, the James Byrd thing happened in Texas. So, I mean, it's not a super common thing, but okay. So guy gets accused of something. They drag him out of his house. They tend to torture him all day in a very public setting. It's usually near a town square or in a public park. And then families come to gather. They bring picnics. There are games going on, and they torture the guy all day. They typically hang him like from his arms or something, usually his arms, from a tree, build a little fire underneath him to scald the bottom of his feet, torture him, throw things at him, that sort of thing. And then toward the end of the day is when they would hang him. People would take souvenirs, which sometimes included ears, toes, or fingers of the dead man, and they would stand next to the dead man and take a picture, which they would later turn into a postcard. There was this group called Without Sanctuary that went around all the country to antique shops and bought postcards, and they ended up with thousands of them. They also started to archive local newspapers, and a lot of local newspapers have digitized all of their old articles, their old newspapers, so you can read some of the stuff online. And it's very common for local newspapers to write stories about the lynchings. So I think in our minds, it's sort of like a real secretive kind of thing that no one ever talked about. But in that era, not only did they talk about it, they participated, like communities participated, and it was a news story. And it wasn't like, oh my gosh, can you believe this happened? It's like, hey, this was our monthly lynching or something. I mean, it wasn't even seen as anything out of the ordinary. It definitely wasn't seen as anything illegal. It's part of the reason the NAACP forms is to try to make lynching illegal. So it's a pretty, I don't even know what we would compare it to. I think it's it's not like a federally government sponsored event. So, you know, the comparison to like the Romans and the lions, that kind of stuff, you know, the public torture kind of thing, you know, it's not a federally sponsored event. So I don't know that that's a direct comparison, but the federal government was not preventing it. Neither was the state government, neither was the local government. So if you're wondering, like, when does the federal government try to step back in to prevent this sort of stuff? You know, it was the 1960s. So they tried briefly during the Reconstruction era, and then we've got like an 80-year period where the federal government goes like, not my problem. And when they think it is their problem again is the 1960s. So it's going to continue until someone puts a stop to it. Yeah. All right. If you're wondering, like, are we treating immigrants well? No, we're not. I mean, but part of the reason we don't like immigrants during this time period, they're not like us, which is, I don't know what like us is, but they're not your average white guy. A lot of them are white guys, but they're not your average white guy. If you're wondering, like, what's your average white guy during this time period? Protestant Christian who speaks English and has a little bit of education. You know, nobody, very rare for anybody to go to college, even necessarily finish high school, but to be literate in English is what we're considering a bit of education now. Sorry for the pause there. Okay. When we get the immigrants from Eastern and Central Europe, our problem with them as a country, it's not, you know, us in the room, but because none of us were there, they're less likely to speak English. They might be Catholic, they might be Eastern or Russian Orthodox, they might even be Jewish. Occasionally they're agnostic, and sometimes they're atheist. We are not okay with atheists during this time period for a while. Sometimes they're from Russia, Austria, Hungary, and usually when you emigrate, you're leaving your country because something's going wrong. I mean, you may want an economic opportunity, or there's some sort of difficulty. Oh, somebody's seen Birth of a Nation. Yeah, and I really do get that sometimes you got to log out, or you're logged out for you and you got to log back in. So don't ever worry about that. I'm just hoping it doesn't happen to me, because I'm worried if, you know, I go down, you guys will not come back. We'll see. We're so close to the end, though. You're probably hoping, like, gosh, I hope the Zoom goes out. No, of course you're not. Okay, back to the immigrants. We really starting to be concerned because there's so many immigrants. It's going to change our culture, and we don't want our culture changed because it's already great. And if somebody changes it, it's not as likely to be great. So we're concerned. So we're going to start looking at ways to limit immigration during this time period. Honestly, before this time period, if you got here, you got to stay. We didn't care. We didn't check. You didn't check in. It's just like, you're here. That's great. We're not deporting anybody. We're not deporting anybody at all until after 1900, probably. But this is the era we'll start to think about how we can regulate who comes in and how we let them in. And we're going to start deciding, if you don't speak English, and if your religious background is not very similar to what we think it should be, we may not want you here. Our other problem with recent immigrants is they're poor. I mean, if you come in, and this is still true, you come in with money, shoot, we don't care where you're from. You know, you have money, you're going to start a business, you're good for the economy, we don't care. If you're working class, we're going to care a little more, because the thought is, oh, they're going to bring down wages. This is definitely not an era where we're thinking, oh, they're just going to get benefits from the government, because there are no benefits from the government unless you're a business owner during this time period. They're desperate for work, the new immigrants, and they bring down wages in an era where there's no minimum wage. And less likely to have formal education, really that kind of translates into they don't read and write in English. And, you know, the truth is, in this era, most people didn't read and write in their native language anyway, because most people didn't have formal education. That will change over time. On the West Coast, the folks people are really disliking are Asian, Chinese in larger numbers, Japanese in smaller numbers. A lot of the Japanese folks who come over during this era are farmers, and they're very productive. Chinese folks in mass, in large groups, came over to work on the railroads or work in the mining industries because those companies advertised for immigrants from those places. So when they got here after the railroads were built, it's like, yeah, we wish you weren't here anymore. So we're going to start passing laws to exclude Asians from owning businesses and land, that sort of stuff. And they noticed that especially Chinese immigrants, but I mean, it's true of Japanese immigrants, Asian immigrants as well, as a group, didn't assimilate necessarily in the same ways as white immigrants, is what people thought. It's mostly because they just don't look like white people, because hey, they're not. So it's easier to pick them out. Also, their languages sound dramatically different than English. And Chinese folks, most of the people who emigrated were men who came to work on the railroad. So their thought was they're going back. So they're not going to change how they dress or how they look, their hairstyle, any of that sort of stuff, because they didn't plan to be permanent residents. They thought as soon as our country improves, the economy's better, we're going back home. That's why it's a whole bunch of dudes. So when they passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s, which does exactly what it sounds like it does, the exception for immigration is that you could bring over your family members. So people started bringing over lots of their sisters who may or may not have been their sisters, so they'd have, you know, they could make families in the United States. They're much less likely to intermarry than other immigrants. Well, and the truth is, and most people who emigrate you kind of live with other people that immigrated from your culture or your background, and you live near them, you socialize with them, and that's pretty common for first generation immigrants. That's what you do, because you got to feel at home somehow in the new country. It makes sense. Yeah. But the thought was on the West Coast, that Asians did not try to assimilate, and at first, the goal wasn't for Chinese immigrants. They thought they would go back home. Gentleman's Agreement, we'll talk about that later because it happens in 1907, because that'll come back up. And Asian land laws, that was really to prevent Asians from owning land. And part of that was because the Japanese farmers who arrived early were so successful that a lot of the local white farmers really resented it. So it was kind of irritating. And the women's groups are going to start to reunify during this era. They'll form the National American Women's Suffrage Movement, and they'll push just generally for women to get the right to vote, and they'll get rid of the racist sentiment that they'd had before, although they're going to bring it back up right before they get the right to vote. All right. And then we will quickly mention labor unions. Excuse me. The two major labor unions in this era, the earliest one and the biggest one during this era, is the Knights of Labor. And then the secondary one that forms is the American Federation of Labor. That's still around. It's combined with the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which happens later, actually splits from the AFL for a variety of reasons, and now they're back together, but they call themselves AFL-CIO. And if you are like a plumber or a tradesman, there are teachers that are members of that group as well. If you're a labor union member, there's a really good chance you're affiliated with the AFL-CIO. Knights of Labor, they said every worker was equal. They didn't favor strikes. They thought owners and workers should work together for what was better for the entire business. The thought was if owners treated workers well, then workers would be more productive and be more loyal to their workplace. And, there's probably some logic to that. But the not favoring the use of strikes kind of limited their ability to protest bad conditions, that sort of thing. So they'll change, they do become more willing to use strikes toward the end of their existence, but They do get discredited after being blamed for some of the violence at the Haymarket Square labor demonstrations in Chicago. What happens is there's a lot of anarchist demonstration there, and I think in some ways some of the protesters that you see, there's so many groups I think that are interspersed in the modern era, but some of the protesters I think probably feel and look and probably have a little more in common philosophically with an anarchist movement from this era. Now, I'm not talking about the ones who are protesting race. I'm talking about the ones who, like the group that got arrested, I guess, last week in New York City for destroying stuff, and most of them have college degrees or from not prominent families, but like super wealthy families where, their parents are millionaires, that sort of stuff. So, that's there. I think also when you look in this era, you see an anarchist movement, and they took over part of the labor demonstrations at Haymarket Square. And the labor union, Knights of Labor, tried to get word out and say, like, hey, everybody just go home because it's going to make us look bad. And there were some people who were members of both the Knights of Labor and the anarchist movement. And they blew stuff up and killed some police officers. And that was bad for their movement. The police and newspapers kind of conspired together, the media and certain, major important groups within the city, and decided to cover the story a certain way and really blame the Knights of Labor, who certainly didn't plan, the violence at Haymarket Square, but they got blamed for it. So their union is really going to dissipate. There were over 1 million members. It was pretty large. And by 1900, the union will be gone. It's replaced by the AFL, which really favors white men who are skilled laborers. So it's not nearly as inclusive, because if Knights of Labor, they didn't care if you were male or female, what industry you were involved in, what your ethnic background was, racial background, you could all be members. They just didn't care. The AFL cares more, focuses more, skilled laborers, white men, traditional, they want what we'll refer to as bread and butter issues, day-to-day stuff, higher wages, better working hours, better working conditions. Strikes will be more limited, and they're more likely to be acceptable to owners and management, because the truth is they kind of look more like guys who own businesses and manage businesses. They're skilled white guys. But you will see some major strikes in this era: Great Railroad Strike, Homestead Steel Strike, and the Pullman Strike. And some of these end pretty violently. But they almost every labor strike in this era ends with the government filing an injunction to prevent the strikes, and law enforcement or the army being called in to stop the workers. And I really can't think of but one instance in this era where, when the government intervenes in a strike, by this era I mean before 1900, where the government intervenes in a strike on the side of the workers, or the workers are successful in their strike. And I think the most successful strike in this era is probably the Ladies Garment Workers Union. They struck, I think that's the right word, against a really expensive clothing company, Hart, Schaffner, and Marks, which is still around, because there's one kind of on that 38th Street area near Mopac in Austin, where there's a lot of little snazzy shops. I don't really shop there very often, but I don't ever shop there. But I drive past there for a variety of reasons. And every time I see that Hart, Schaffner, and Marks, I go, oh my gosh, they're still around. So they had a lot of immigrant women tailors who made handmade suits, and they sold them for exorbitant amounts of money and paid these immigrant women tailors next to nothing. They sort of resented that. And they said, you know what, we're going to go on strike till you pay us more. And they just went like, whatever, go on strike. We'll just hire more of you. You know a lot of people that can make a men's suit by hand? Because I don't. And there weren't a lot of people back then that could do it either. They had such a unique skill that they called them back and gave them the wage increase in about 2 weeks. They didn't have to do anything violent at all. They just quit. So, and I think you know this as well. I got an 8-minute warning. Thank you. I appreciate it. I think you know this as well. The more skilled you are at your job, as long as it's in demand, the more power you have in the workplace. So like, all the guys who bag groceries at HEB, which that, of course, that's a more HEB worker is much more valuable in this era than probably ever. But, the skill that you have can be taught pretty quickly. And like my job, I'm in a weird spot because I have this weird knowledge of US history, which very few people want. I know you do desperately, but I mean, as employers, it's hard to market that skill because especially in the Austin area, like your waiter at Olive Garden probably has a degree in history as well. So it's hard. I have a unique skill, but it's not terribly marketable. If you're a plumber, a mechanic, or, you have a unique skill that is marketable, so you're going to make more money than me. And God bless you for that. I mean, that's cool. All right. I think we're going to stop here with the idea that government likes big business. Government's not enforcing civil rights during this era for workers, for African Americans, for Asian Americans, for anybody, because the government just really likes big business. Farmers make a little bit of an inroad politically, but it's kind of brief and short-lived. And then one of the major parties takes over their issues, and then you see the Populist Party go away. So the second part of the chapter, which is probably the shortest part, but historically pretty important, is about the Spanish-American War, which we will talk about next time. And I will check to see if I have any more warnings or information from you guys before we go. Oh, and roll, I guess. Was Harsha here? Let me see who else I didn't get. Harsha. Tanya Rahman, are you here? And Karamatula. All right, those are the 3 people I didn't see. If you're one of those people, tell me or write it in the chat because I looked. All right, I'm going to stop recording.